Hello. In today's video, you're going to find out why you should replace your control arm bushing if you have a leaky power steering hose in your Corolla FX. The power steering hose in the Corolla FX is a long hose that wraps around the engine and will likely leak with age. The problem with this hose leaking is that power steering fluid gets onto the control arm bushing and bracket. The fluid destroys the bushing and can cause the control arm bracket to slide side to side. The Corolla FX is very sensitive to bad control arm bushings and should be replaced if you notice fluid on them. Start by loosening the lug nuts and then raise the Corolla FX safely onto jack stands. Remove the driver's side wheel. If you have a 4AGE with ITBs, you can remove the intake trumpets to give you much easier access to the power steering hose. Make sure to stick some paper towels into the throttle bodies to stop things from accidentally falling into the engine. Take a good look at both the high pressure and low pressure hoses to see if there is an obvious leak coming from either one. The other place to check is at the steering rack. I wiped down the steering rack connections and ran the engine for 5 minutes while turning the steering wheel side to side. I found that I had another leak from the low pressure line that needed to be repaired. Before I can remove the power steering hose, I need to drain the power steering fluid. I made a little cup to catch the fluid from the reservoir and then disconnected the hose going to the power steering pump. I had a second cup ready for when the first one filled up. The next step was to turn on the engine and drain the remaining fluid into the cup, but this went horribly wrong. Yep, it's just as I thought. That's exactly what I thought would happen. Now that I got the power steering fluid all cleaned up and you know what not to do, we're going to try it again, but this time using a hose so that it goes directly in the container instead of dripping down. I ended up using a 5/8 hose running directly into a bottle. Before turning on the engine and draining the fluid, make sure the hose is clear of any spinning parts. There are 4 metal clamps that hold the power steering hose in place. Remove the 10mm bolt and the clamp will come apart. Disconnect the fitting from the steering rack using a 17mm wrench. Have a container ready to catch any fluid that will drip down. Disconnect the fitting from the power steering pump with a 17mm wrench. Now you can remove the hose from the car. I zip-tied a glove on each end of the hose to stop it from dripping on everything while I removed it. So this is me about a month and a half later. I've been hunting and trying to find a replacement power steering hose, but ultimately I couldn't buy a new one. I went to a couple of hydraulic shops that were near me and they only worked on standard hoses and couldn't help me. So I ended up driving to this fellow that was about 2 hours away that had the equipment to make replacement hose parts for my existing one. So it looks wonderful, and I'll put his information up here in case you guys wanted to use it. But see if you can try to reuse your existing hose, because otherwise it won't fit as good and the brackets won't mount in the same spots. Just to give you guys an example of what I'm talking about, this is a hose that I had ordered online, and at first glance it looks like it might be the right one, but then when you compare the hose that came out of the Corolla, you can see it's like totally different hose. It's not long enough, it doesn't have the right bends, and there's not a chance that it would work. So you're going to want to get yourself an open socket wrench like that you can attach onto a 3/8 extension so you can get it within that small hole so you can tighten the power steering hose. Isn't that right, Leo? So you can tighten that power steering hose. On the low pressure hose, I'm going to try torquing it to spec and see if it fixes the leak. Test fit the repaired hose and see if it lines up with the mounting brackets. Finger tighten both ends of the power steering hose. Reinstall the 4 mounting brackets before you tighten down the fittings on the hose. Get your torque wrench and set it to 22 foot-pounds to tighten the fitting that connects up to the power steering pump. Do not over-tighten. Then torque the hose at the steering rack to 33 foot-pounds. Fill up the reservoir with power steering fluid and run the engine for a few seconds, and then top it up with some more fluid. Run the engine again and turn the steering wheel side to side to get any air out of the system. Run the engine for 5 minutes while steering from side to side to test the hoses for any leaks. I ran the car for 5 minutes and there's no leaks anywhere. Not on the power steering rack, not on the power steering pump, and nowhere on the hose. So now we're ready to move on to replace the control arm bushing. Loosen the rear control arm nut and then the bracket bolts. Remove the front control arm bolt. Remove the rear bracket and nut. Then pull down the control arm to slip off the bushing. My bushing was soaked in power steering fluid and looked pretty beat up, and warranted being replaced. The old control arm bushing is out now, so I'm going to put in this new Nolathane control arm bushing, which is made by Whiteline, and it's one of their subsidiaries, so it should be a direct fit without having to do anything special. So let's put it in. If your bushing retainers were like mine and had a lot of rubber stuck to them, you'll want to clean them up. Using a wire brush wheel, I got the rubber off and revealed the grooves in the retainer that are meant to grip the new bushing. If I hadn't gotten the rubber off, it might have caused the bushing to slip inside the retainer. Before you install the new bushing, you'll have to put some lube on it to stop it from squeaking. You're going to work the lube all over the shaft. Really get it lubed up good and cover all of it, but make sure not to get any of the lube on the outside of the bushing. Now, take the shaft and insert it into the... you know what, you get the idea. Now, as I was getting ready to bolt in the new bushings, I noticed something very odd about my brackets. They were not symmetrical and looked like they were misshapen. They needed to be replaced. So I went on a side quest to find some brackets at my local pick and pull. I searched through the automotive graveyard and found something unexpected. Is that Carmen Electra on the cover of a Playboy? That's a weird thing to find in a Honda engine bay. Wait a minute, is that also an old nudie tape? It's almost like some weird, arousing sign from above. Well, whatever it wasn't what I was looking for. But I did end up finding a 1986 AE82 Corolla sedan. I took both the control arm brackets off of it, which were perfect by the way. Then, I raided the interior for a plastic cover for the steering column. I busted a huge hole in mine with my knee at an autocross last year. All the four-door Corollas in the US of A were powered by the 90 horsepower carbureted 4ALC. This was an engine designed more for fuel efficiency than performance. With no 4AG available, there was never the same excitement for the four-doors as there was in other countries like Malaysia, South Africa, and Costa Rica. The only 4AG powered four-door in the United States was not even a Toyota, but a Chevrolet. But that's a story for another time. Back in the garage, you can see my original bracket was in pretty bad shape. If you notice your bracket isn't symmetrical, you should replace it. Clean the control arm before installing the new bushings. Note that the two bushing retainers are not the same. Install the one with the taper first. Slip on the new bushing, and then install the rear retainer with the grooves facing the bushing. Finger tighten the bracket, and then finger tighten the front control arm bolt. In the factory manual, it specifies that you finger tighten the bolts and then lower the car onto the ground. Then, you bounce it up and down to stabilize the suspension. Go to each corner of the car and bounce it up and down a few times. After a good bouncing, torque the rear bolts to 64 foot-pounds. Then torque the front bolt to 105 foot-pounds. Lastly, torque the rear nut to 76 foot-pounds. Now that the control arm bolts are all tightened down, I'm going to reinstall the intake trumpets and the filter, and then take the car out for a drive and test it. Well, it's a week later, and the hoses are holding up great. There's no more leaks from the power steering rack, and the control arm bushings have really improved the handling. The steering is much tighter, and the cornering response is better as well. So I would say if you can, just check your control arm bushings on these old Corolla FXs, because they make a world of a difference in the handling. Alrighty, until next time, and thanks for watching. And in case you haven't met, this is Leopold. He's my other floofy kitty. Here he is, look at him, look at him. He's so glorious and floofy. So floofy, yeah. Such a fluffy kitty.